3CT colleagues felt that given the pressures of contemporary capitalism on the university system, given calls for divestment from companies profiting from the war in Gaza and university responses to student protest, given the powerful role boards of trustees play in the intellectual agendas of our education system, we needed to explore these questions with a robust scholarly approach. So it's my pleasure in that spirit to welcome Charlie Eaton, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Merced, where he co-founded the Higher Education, Race, and Economy Lab. His research investigates the role of politics, organizations, and race in the interplay between economic elites and insurgent social groups. He's the author of Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Troubling Rise of Financiers in U.S. Higher Education, which is a University of Chicago press book from 2022. And his research has been covered by many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsweek, The Nation, MarketWatch, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. We're also lucky to have our very own Gabriel Winant as the discussant. As many of you know, Professor Winant is a historian of the social structures of inequality in modern American capitalism. He's the author of a wonderful book entitled The Next Shift, The Fall of Manufacturing and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America. That was Harvard University Press, 2021. And he also writes frequently for publications such as The Nation, Dissent, and N+1. Winant is an associate professor of history and the college at the university here and a fellow at 3CT. Before getting started, I want to thank the staff at 3CT for all of their hard work, including the labor of getting a talk like this together with very little preparation time and on the backs of two very large conferences. In particular, I would like to thank student assistants Lucy De Silva and Delaney Wallace, our program coordinator Ryan Eckholt, and our fabulous associate director Anna Searle Jones. Please give them a hand.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for that really generous introduction and for having me. I'm going to do something a little risky today, and I'm going to explore some new ideas for me about how to understand the Trump administration's attack on universities. I've been writing about this on my Substack newsletter that you can find here at my website, charlieeaton.net, if you want to follow that work. All right, I'll bump it up. And what I'm trying to do is coalesce some of what I've learned from a flurry of conversations that I've been really fortunate to have since the publication of a New York Times essay I wrote about a month ago that was titled $15 billion is enough to fight a president. The $15 billion refers to the endowment of Columbia University. Since then, I've been gratified that a number of universities have decided that their endowments were big enough to fight a president, and encouraged by it. And with events continuing to unfold, I'm hoping to learn some more from this conversation with you all. The overall idea that I'm going to play with is that the attack on elite higher education is not an attack by non-elites. Rather, it's a power struggle between rival elites, including those of us in this room who should probably be counted among the cultural elite. This perspective, I think, can help to explain the otherwise puzzling elite support for Trump's attacks. And in turn, that might help us to develop better strategies for both defending universities and for reforming them to make them more broadly serve society. Before developing my hypothesis, let's consider some facts about the attacks that we're trying to explain. Here's a list of 6 major demands of Harvard from the Trump administration. These directly quote from the letter sent by Trump's lawyers to Harvard on April 11th, just over a month ago. The New York Times reported that to Penny Pritzker, the chair of Harvard's board. The letter, quote, the letter read like the start of a hostile takeover. As a private equity investor herself, Pritzker is very familiar with hostile takeovers, and the Trump demands to audit all Harvard admissions and hiring decisions certainly support her view. Since Harvard rejected these demands, the Trump administration has said that it will take the following punitive actions. First, freezing $2.2 billion in existing NIH and NSF grants. Second, banning Harvard from any future government research grants. Third, revoking Harvard's tax-exempt status. And fourth, eliminating visa eligibility for international Harvard students. 6 other elite universities, including Northwestern here in Chicago, have suffered similar targeted cuts, and dozens of other elite universities are under investigation. And all research universities have been targeted with cuts to NIH and NSF indirect cost funding. At first, it might seem a little surprising that some factions of U.S. economic elites have supported or at least accepted these attacks. Some of these elites are supporting devastating cuts to the same universities where they graduated, sent their kids, donated millions of dollars, or even serve on the boards of trustees. So what's going on here? I've been thinking about 2 explanations for the Trump attacks that are not mutually exclusive. First, Trump is mobilizing an anti-elitist authoritarianism that appeals to a working class that is alienated or excluded from universities. Second, these attacks are part of a war within and between cultural and economic elites. I'm mostly going to talk about the second explanation today, but I'll briefly note a few hypotheses that fit with the first explanation. First, the first kind of hypothesis is that Trump alone is seeking authoritarian power by suppressing universities as hubs of dissent in a free society. The second kind of extension of this explanation is that this primarily appeals to university resentment among Trump's white working class base. And third, economic elites who govern universities might go along with this because they fear punishment from Trump themselves. I'm not putting these hypotheses out there as straw men. My own book explains how exclusion and exploitation result from inequalities involving endowments, student debt, and financiers running higher education. And I highly recommend the New York Times essay last week from Stephen Levitsky, Lucan Wei, and Daniel Ziblatt. They say the U.S. has already descended into what they call competitive authoritarianism, where people, and especially elites, stop opposing the government because it will result in costly punishment. And they enumerate how broadly this has happened in the last 100 days among elites in the media, finance, tech, law, and nonprofits. While resistance has been disappointing at times, particularly in some corners of higher education, elite university opposition to Trump is actually relatively high compared to these other elite domains. On the other side of the ledger, though, for that anti-elitist explanation, there's less working class demand for punishing universities than you might imagine. Recent polls from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Data for Progress have shown the following. 77% oppose cuts to medical research funding, 70% oppose increased federal involvement in how private universities operate, 67% oppose cuts to Pell Grants and student loans, and 63% oppose deporting legal migrants or immigrants who have protested Israel. And when you look at the crosstabs for these surveys by education, there's not a sharp educational divide. But to pivot to that elite power struggle explanation, even where we do see declining non-elite trust in universities, some of this may flow from idea and media work of certain elite factions. And in this formulation, Trump attacks articulate broader elite hostility towards universities. In this account, Trump is mobilizing right-wing cultural elites who already see universities as existential threats to white masculine identity and status. But Trump is also pushed by an emergent coalition between cultural elites and economic elites who also feel that their own status and or their wealth is threatened by universities. It's just a kind of theoretical bookmark or placement for this. I think this perspective fits with Bourdieu's idea of elites existing in a field of power. Bourdieu writes in The State Nobility that the field of power is a field of power struggles among different holders of different forms of power, a gaming space in which those agents and institutions possessing enough specific capital, economic or cultural capital in particular, to be able to occupy the dominant positions within their respective fields, confront each other using strategies aimed at preserving or transforming these relations of power. The idea of an elite war on higher education also fits with the relational power theory developed by Rebecca Imai and Dylan Riley in their introduction to a new edited volume on elite theory. Building on Bourdieu, C. Wright Mills, and Richard Lockman, they see elites as restricted groups that have inordinate influence on society, but who are constituted through different types of power relations to non-elites. Unsatisfied by Bourdieu's coarser categories of economic and cultural capital, Imai and Riley categorize power relations between elites and non-elites as involving material power, organizational power, associational power, status power, coalitional power, and ideational power. It's a lot of different powers. Drawing on my own work, we might see universities as financialized fields of power. In these fields of power, varied cultural and economic elites struggle for power appropriated through universities. Financialized universities have become sites for building and transacting nearly every type of power over non-elites in the Imai and Riley typology. We see this with elite families competing to get their kids admitted and corporations competing to recruit graduates. We see it with alumni giving naming donations and seeking trustee appointments, with alumni networks and university boards also providing associational power and social ties to other elites. We see it with donation and endowment investing opportunities providing material power that underwrites faculty and administrators. And we see faculty using those resources to freely pursue ideational power and amplifying their research and ideas. One thing to note is that across all this transaction, endowment hoarding is all good and really does happen. But if we view universities as fields of power, this begs the question, why should elites, or at least some elites, attack the rules of the field? I suppose that all is fair in love and war, so why not attack the rules of the field to try to gain advantage? But I think we can be more specific about why this attack and why now. And I see four potential reasons. First, we've had a right-wing cultural elite essentially secede from universities and be radicalized in their cable TV and social media bubbles. And this may have been accelerated by the digital transition during COVID. Second, right-wing cultural elites and some economic elites may feel growing status threats from increasing diversity among the university educated. And these status threats may be heightened by increasingly hegemonic ideas in universities about inequality and diversity. Finally, finance and tech elites may see material threats that I'm going to unpack in this talk from policy-engaged social science, in which they see universities as liberal think tanks, whether they're right or wrong in that perception. So I'm going to present some initial evidence of Trump attacks as an elite counteroffensive against these perceived threats. And the evidence is going to come from a case study that I've started of elite political mobilization that began with secret elite signal chat groups. The largest of these chat groups was Chatham House, which was named after a British think tank that convenes confidential discussions among elites that they say is a good thing to do because it makes people feel free to say things that they wouldn't say in public. The chat groups and subsequent cultural mobilization was mostly led by billionaire venture capitalist Mark Andreessen. Andreessen's venture capital firm A16Z is one of the largest in the world. Andreessen has historically supported Democrats, including Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, but has shifted over the last several years. These chats were first reported on by Ben Smith, an investigative reporter in Semaphore, on April 27th of this year. And according to Smith, a lot of what got said in the chats subsequently made its way into public discussions on Twitter and podcasts. And so this provides a substantial body of text recording the statements of tech, financier, and right-wing cultural elites in their conversations with each other. So Smith reports that around 300 elites were added to the Chatham House signal group. He has only reported the names of these 20 as participants. I'm trying to get the names of more. I've grouped them together as finance, tech, and cultural elites. And you can see that almost all of the finance participants are from venture capital. The tech elites are from firms with large stakes in government contracting and regulation, which relates to another kind of stream of my research on private equity. And the cultural elites are mostly from the right, with the exception of pollster David Shore and whatever we might call Larry Summers. So Chris Rufo, who's a Manhattan University fellow and a big mover and shaker in the right-wing movement against universities, he told Smith that he had approached the chats as a conscious power-building effort to build a coalition between tech elites and right-wing cultural elites. Andreessen has also pointed to universities as a key target for his agenda. Andreessen has this podcast called The Ben and Mark Show, and it's with Ben Horowitz, who's the co-founder of his venture capital firm. Horowitz is also a Columbia University trustee emeritus, and on their interest in universities, Andreessen said in a January 12, 2024 podcast, quote, "Both Ben and I have a lot of friends that are trying to basically make universities better. People who are on boards or are running universities, presidents or endowment heads, alumni, professors. Those are their friends." Horowitz added, "And they are universities that produce the elites, and the elites end up running a lot of things." So at first you might not expect great hostility toward universities from Ben and Mark. After all, Ben was a trustee who made major donations to Columbia. Mark's father-in-law, John Arriaga, has several buildings named after him for donating hundreds of millions of dollars to Stanford. But both the Chatham House chats and the Ben and Mark Show provide some suggestions that status threats may motivate some of the hostility, even among elites like Ben and Mark. Describing how the secret Chatham House chats began, Ben Smith reported in Semaphore, quote, "Two participants said Silicon Valley executives commiserated about how to handle employee demands that they, for instance, declare that, quote, Black Lives Matter, unquote," I don't know why he put that in quotation marks, but he did, "or support policies they didn't actually believe in around transgender rights." On the Ben and Mark Show, Ben Horowitz, not Ben Smith, told listeners that he raised concern about DEI programs and policies on the Columbia University board, and, quote, "The leadership was like, 'Shut the fuck up. You're so outside the religion, we can't even hear a word you're saying.'" More surprising to me, and as I've started to study this, is that Andreessen has claimed that finance and tech elites are economically threatened by universities. And in a January podcast, he said this threat originates from universities essentially becoming left-wing policy think tanks. If that is surprising news to you, consider how Andreessen elaborates on his argument in this November 2024 interview with Joe Rogan shortly after the election. referring to Elizabeth Warren as a sort of Harvard law professor-in-chief, Andreessen told Rogan, "We have this thing called the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, CFPB, Elizabeth Warren's personal agency, that just gets to run and do whatever it wants, terrorize finance. The Biden administration was like flat out tried to kill us, tried to kill crypto, and they were on their way to killing AI. FTC was thoroughly weaponized. The SEC can investigate you, they can subpoena you, they can prosecute you." In this last podcast interview that I'll discuss today, Andreessen shared his planned counteroffensive with Lex Fridman in January. So months before we all began to experience this on our campuses, Andreessen told Fridman, "The population at large is going to realize the corruption in universities, and it's going to withdraw the funding. Universities are funded by 4 primary sources of federal funding. The big one is federal student loan program. Number 2, federal research funding. Number 3 is tax exemption at the operating level. Number 4 is tax exemptions at the endowment level." So it's the 4 punishments that Harvard received, all announced on the Lex Fridman show in January. If you withdraw those sources of federal tax money and state money, they all instantly go bankrupt, and then you can rebuild. So I think this gives us a different picture. I don't think we should take everything that Mark Andreessen is saying on face value. I don't know that we can know how much of what is he saying he believes, or how much any of his other interlocutors believe exactly what they're saying, but it gives a sort of different picture of the motivations behind the elite university attacks by the Trump administration. I'll conclude with a few thoughts on what is to be done if, in fact, we are facing an elite war on universities. My overall assessment is that financialization has created both vulnerabilities and resources that should be leveraged in the short term. First, as I argued in the Times essay, endowments can be spent to keep the lights on. Second, elite and non-elite coalitions can be built around the mutual harms from the elite war on universities. Freedom of speech and freedom from fear is something that's at risk for all, both elite and non-elite. Immigrants and judges alike have been arrested. NIH funding cuts threaten life-saving treatments for both the rich and poor. To date, middle class and working class non-elites from diverse communities have actually been more bold in publicly opposing Trump than most elites have. And this shows the potential coalitional power in elite, non-elite alliances. My third thought on what is to be done is litigate everything in a visible and coordinated way. There's actually far more litigation by universities happening than even most of you probably are aware of. But I think we need a more public, coordinated legal campaign of challenges to Trump's illegal actions on a scale that's so large and intense that it paralyzes his administration and floods the media with stories of his lawlessness. Universities right now aren't really even doing press releases when they file lawsuits. And this is because they do not want to be noticed and singled out by Trump or his aides. To lift up their legal resistance, I think university leaders should take a similar approach to the open letter signed by more than 500 college and university presidents, including nearly every Ivy League president and every University of California chancellor in my state. In case you missed it, that letter declared that those university leaders would not accept, quote, undue government intrusion into the lives of those who learn, live, and work on our campuses. The fourth thing I think that could be done is that faculty and students could be more assertive in doing what we do best, which is learning and teaching at a bigger scale about the elite war on universities. And I know this talk is coming at the end of the semester, but this might be done with an idea to the cycles of life that'll be happening in the fall semester. And this kind of work could produce viral media on Trump's corruption and lawlessness for broad audiences, or lay groundwork for mass assemblies on campuses like those that we saw around Occupy Wall Street. and Black Lives Matter in earlier days. Finally, I think this all needs to be done with an eye to Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill, which will be the next major inflection point in the war on the university. This bill is his tax cut and spending cut package that would make his cuts to federal research funding permanent and would extend the cuts to Pell Grants and student loans. With Congress narrowly divided, Republicans can only lose 3 votes in either chamber to pass the legislation. They already appear to be abandoning most of their cuts to Medicaid because of organized opposition and protest that is working. But there's currently no comparable coalition campaign to stop the cuts to federal research. In the longer term, I think we need to put forward a vision for the day after. We won't win the war if we wait until it's over to put forward this vision. A starting point for such a vision is that we shouldn't rebuild universities with the same problems and vulnerabilities to the attacks we're facing. I have 3 general thoughts about how we should deleverage our financial dependence as part of this. First, we could rebalance university boards to include more diverse non-elites. It may not be a coincidence that, like Ben Horowitz, 46% of Columbia's trustees are from big finance, a higher rate than for all but 5 of the top private universities. This is in contrast with elite universities that have resisted Trump. Just 23% of the Harvard board and 35% of the Princeton board are from finance. Interestingly, the New York Times reported that the only board opponent of Harvard's decision to resist is the KKR private equity manager, Joe Bay, who was recently appointed to the board to improve its viewpoint diversity. Second, I think we should regulate endowments to serve the public interest. Endowment hoarding is a real problem, as I could detail in our discussion. By putting forward no serious policies to address this, university leaders and policy thinkers have left a vacuum for disingenuous right-wing proposals to tax endowments. And then finally, I think we need to move from PR to policies that expand public benefits provided by universities. I think it's a good thing that Harvard and others have moved away from talking about themselves as exclusive places that are apart from and above everyone else. This can open space for policy change when we talk instead about universities as open to and benefiting everyone. Depending on the university, policy moves in this direction could begin with expanding undergraduate enrollment, increasing affordability, or both. Without such initiatives, I think any peace for universities that we might win would be short-lived.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. As I'm sure you know, here we have a board of trustees that I think is characterized to an extremely unusual degree by almost exclusively kind of presence of finance and similar kind of economic elites, to the point that they haven't even had to send a ransom note to us because those forces are already so present in the institution. So I have a few questions. I'll ask them to you. We'll talk a little bit, and then we'll open it up. The first is about the political composition of the elite presence on Board of Trustees, and in particular, if there's a way of decomposing it, decomposing that elite, I suppose economically or politically or both, so that we could think of the kind of fractions and fractures potentially among them. It seems to me that the political project suggested in your talk will require some kind of challenge politically to them, and figuring out on what lines it might divide would be a helpful thing to understand.
Yeah, so a limitation of my book, and also I have a paper that came out recently in Socioeconomic Review with Albina Gibadulina, who's a postdoc at Brown. And a limitation of that work is that in mapping the composition of university boards, we've primarily focused on charting the share of board members coming from finance and coming particularly from private equity and hedge funds. And so there's been a very large increase in that share of board members, going from 15 to 20% of boards in the top 30 private universities in the 1980s to an average of 35% today. So Princeton's kind of in the average. Harvard's actually on the low side, which may surprise people. And Columbia, I can't remember. I meant to look up Chicago, but I didn't look up the composition, but I think it's on the high side. And we don't have as much about the other types of economic elites on the board beyond looking at how many are from business, from non-financial business. And we don't have a differentiation, for example, between tech, which in this account that I gave today matters a lot, or appears like it could matter a lot. But one thing that I can say from this research that I think is an insight for thinking about boards is, why do people join boards, and why do some elites join boards more than others? And so the key thing that we've found across my book and this article is that one reason you get financiers joining boards at higher rates is that they are alumni of elite universities at higher rates, even compared to tech. So private equity, hedge fund, venture capital guys have top 30 private university degrees. Among the 400 wealthiest Americans, it's like 60% of them have top 30 private university degrees. Among tech billionaires, it's like only 30%, and it's similar for other business folks. So they just, because of the pipeline, but also maybe because of the business model of finance, you have more of these folks with elite degrees. The second thing is, what is it about the business model of finance that makes them have elite degrees more? Well, particularly in private equity and hedge funds and venture capital, what they all do is they trade in private information. They're trying to beat public markets by making investments based on private information because they know there's going to be a policy change. They know that Trump is going to deregulate crypto, so make your big move on crypto. There's a bunch of examples in the book about different defense spending. I think, remind me the name of your, David Rubenstein is your board chair?
Yeah.
And his private equity firm is Carlyle, one of the biggest private equity firms in the world. There's a fantastic article that I recommend to everyone by Michael Lewis. You might know Michael Lewis wrote the book The Big Short, also Liar's Poker. He has an early 1990s article titled Access Capitalism, and it's about Carlyle. And the Carlyle model was doing a lot, particularly in the defense space of investment, based on insider access and knowledge about government programs and government spending around defense. So if you trade in access to private information that you get from elites, well, being on an elite university board is very valuable because it is a source of private information, both specific private information that you can use to trade on, but also information that the economic sociologist and organizational theorist Mark Mizrachi calls cognitive range. It gives you a very panoptic view of the economy that you can make these investment decisions on to beat public markets. So I think for that reason, you actually have fewer tech guys who are on the boards, I suspect. Because they have a slightly different model. But one of the things that I'm trying to get a handle on, and it's kind of where my next project is going that relates to this, what I presented today, is what is the relationship between tech and finance as this new kind of center of power?
Yeah, I wonder in that vein, there's been a lot of commentary about the radicalization of the tech elite over the last few years, and that gets attributed to different things. I wonder if you could kind of evaluate some of those theories and then connect them back to the question of the antagonism between the tech elite and universities. One attribution is political challenge from below, internal to tech firms, right? And you talked about that some. Different kinds of social movement activity rippling across the society at large, appearing also inside the tech industry. Another is a changed economic environment, right? The tech industry, as we knew it, was built in essentially a zero interest rate environment. And I'm curious if you think that is in play in any way here. And then I suppose a third would be, and again, right, this appears in Andreessen's kind of account, a kind of encounter with a larger economic populist politics kind of making its way into policymaking in some form through market regulation and so on. Are these all at work? Are they in kind of tension with each other? And well, I have a follow-up, but I'll let you address that first.
Yeah, I don't, I'm trying to figure this out
Yeah.
with you today.
Yeah.
I don't think I have clarity on how much of this is one or the other. I think, because all of us want, or because many of us social scientists, the left-wing think tank social scientists that Andreessen hates, because we aspire to a better world, I think many of us were perhaps disappointed by the Biden administration and Bidenomics. But I actually do think there was at least an effort in the Biden administration to do some things that were quite different on economic policy. The most clear one is antitrust policy. Really did change under the leadership of Lina Khan. And Andreessen's kind of onto something actually, to say that a lot of the movement on antitrust policy and financial regulation does come out of academic law, and so hard for me to, it's hard for me to parse, how much of this is cultural dynamics, including within tech firms, how much of this is genuine economic threat, how much of this is perceived economic threat, or how much of this is opportunism and rent seeking. I mean, the new Trump patronage state could be quite an opportunity for some quarters of tech.
Related to this, one kind of conceptual as well as political challenge that comes out of this analysis and this set of issues is the seeming abandonment of the kind of historic elite legitimation function of universities, right? That part of what universities have done, probably for virtually all of the lifetimes of everyone here, is kind of engage in a kind of negotiated, slow process of elite circulation, if you like, right? Historically, I think that's given rise to a kind of critique of universities and the kind of politics of liberal inclusion of the university from the left in a certain way, right? That this is actually a way that social challenges get absorbed and diffused and so on. This is familiar to everyone here, I'm sure, this idea. And it's interesting to see, and frightening in a way, but also, again, sort of confusing to see that abandoned. I mean, thinking of Andreessen, I'm sure no one besides me in this room kind of has this particular pathology, but sometimes I have to admit I find myself on Twitter now stumbling very frequently on some insane Nazi kind of account, right? Because Twitter pushes them on you relentlessly, and the pathological thing that I do is click on it and read more. Because it's so, I don't know, it gets under my skin in whatever way. And in doing that, I've noticed, and maybe you've noticed also, without fail, you click on some account of some person who's tweeting about skull sizes and how Hitler was right. I mean, literally, genuine Nazism. Mark Andreessen follows them every time. To the point that, in fact, it's clear it's automated, right? That he's not doing it manually, but he's automated in some way for his account to find Nazis and follow them. So, this guy who supported Hillary Clinton in 2016, right, is like sucking up ideology about, polygenesis of races or something. And that seems like a very profound rupture in that legitimation function. So I guess I'd be curious to just hear you talk about, was the legitimation function never real? Did it never work in the way that we thought it did? What is happening there?
Well, I'm actually having trouble linking the legitimation function to the Andreessen.
So, right.
Andreessen
Well, in other words, that there was
Andreessen Nazi following.
right. There was once right again the pathology. Right. There was once a kind of elite cohesion function. Right.
Yeah.
That the liberal kind of liberal policy of elite universities in recomposing the elite gradually accomplished, and that elites widely seem to believe that it accomplished, such that someone like Andreessen would be, as you said in the talk, entangled with people who give money to universities, and would himself be a Hillary Clinton supporter, and so on, right? And now they seem not to require that legitimation function anymore, or at least to believe that they don't, right? Which is observable in the fact not only that he wants to destroy and rebuild universities, but also that that ideological positions way beyond the pale of what was once a kind of narrower political spectrum have become available.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I wonder about is just the scale of wealth of people in Andreessen's position. And obviously, the person I didn't mention in the talk is Elon Musk, right? But he also, figures in this as the richest person in the history of the world. The number of billionaires, I think, in the U.S. is something like tripled in the last couple of decades. And so one question that I have is there some greater sense of autonomy and freedom that's felt among folks who have that level of wealth? And then also is there a sort of tipping point in the MAGA movement and the Trump movement that creates a permission structure that allows people to totally break with and embrace ideas that would previously have exiled them from the elite? Yeah. There's a quote that I didn't include from the Joe Rogan interview that Andreessen gave, in which he talks about how there are now two types of dinner parties in Silicon Valley, and in his account, there's half of them are people who all agree with everything that's ever written in the New York Times, and just accept the New York Times publication as gospel, and then the other half are free-thinking individuals like Mark Andreessen. Which I share in part to point out, there is a divide among the economic elite, so that he's talking about among the very wealthy in Silicon Valley.
Okay, maybe I'll ask you one more question. It's one on my mind, and I think on minds of other colleagues here as we try to think about our own board. You talked about the need to change the composition of the boards, which I totally agree with. As a political project, it seems quite daunting, right? Self-governing bodies that have no levers of accountability available, right? I mean, even faculty senates and so on typically have virtually no real lever over a board. How would you assess strategic vulnerabilities in terms of the kind of points of attack for that?
Well, I mean, I think critical, breakdowns in institutions, like major breakdowns in institutions, are really the moments in which you potentially get major change in institutions. It's, kind of critical juncture theory. So if there's ever going to be a moment where you could change the dynamics on boards in this way, I think it's now. I think you might think about the outcomes as a little bit more along a continuous spectrum than as either we get a board that represents society more, at least society that actually supports free speech and freedom of thought, rather than thinking about it as that, it's more just black or white, binary, do you get it or not? It's how much do you get it or not? I mean, at public universities, you probably noticed public universities are really missing from the story here. And that's in part because public universities, you do not have, it's like 5% of board members are financiers. And the reason is that public university boards are tied to the democratic polity. They're in most places appointed by governors. In some places, like Michigan and Wisconsin, they're directly elected by voters. And actually, an interesting backstory, some of you might have followed this, the departure of Santa Ono from University of Michigan to get his pay doubled from $1.5 million to $3 million by going to University of Florida. And part of the backstory there is he was in conflict with the Michigan Board of Regents, which is elected by voters and is like a 6-2 Democrat to Republican majority, not a group of progressive Democrats, but a group that wanted Michigan to resist more than Santa Ono did. So I was with Beth Pop Berman, a friend of mine from Michigan, last weekend, and she was saying like a lot of things that weren't really making sense started to make more sense when Ono announced his departure. So, different university boards are in different contexts. I would also say in the immediate, for the case of Chicago, but David Rubenstein, my access capitalism criticisms notwithstanding, he is not a Mark Andreessen. And I think if we're being strategic about the fight and the immediate threats, we shouldn't just lump David Rubenstein in with Mark Andreessen or Ben Horowitz from the Columbia Board. One of the fascinating dynamics of Harvard's decision to resist is that, Penny Pritzker and Alan Garber, of whom I've got friends from Harvard who have plenty of criticisms of them, after they decide to resist, they go out and they work the donors to support them, right? They go and they do these donor conference calls, and the New York Times says that they get pushback on the donor conference calls. So I think you want to think about who can you push on your board to hold the line and to take what kind of actions when there really are existential threats, and can you get some members of the elite? David Rubenstein comes very much from the Democratic establishment, and so are there ways that you can lever that to your advantage?
Okay, let's open it up for questions. Yeah, back there.
I'm just going to grab the mic for the recording.
Are you okay?
Thank you. I think it would be helpful to hear you talk some more about endowment hoarding and just sort of unpack that for us, because I think that's a kind of would be helpful as we think about talking to our colleagues and as we think about talking to our administrators, and because it kind of endowments are often framed as a kind of something that we protect for the good of some future. And as a kind of asterisk to that, like a head scratcher here locally has been, but I think this is a broader phenomenon, that these boards that are populated by finance bros essentially do very badly at kind of making the endowment, protecting the endowment, or they just invest it very, very badly. And here, I think, is that kind of a symptom of a kind of macho sort of testosterone risk-taking? That seems to be some of what's at play here, but also here locally, they recently lost a bunch of money on Bitcoin investments. Like, is there a politics to that? Like, what is happening?
Yeah, thank you. All of that. So I don't start with the endowment hoarding and all the statistics about that, because it's kind of my shtick. And so I wanted to do something a little fresh, but it is also probably the shtick that I have that is of the most public service, and that's why it got published in the Times. So yeah, endowment hoarding. One thing to remember is there's a big difference across endowments, and I should have looked up your Chicago statistics before I came, but Chicago's endowment is not the same in relative size to the Princeton endowment. So I've been, vocally supportive of Princeton's president, Chris Eisengruber, for his leadership in resisting the Trump attacks. And he's done that as the chair of the Association of American Universities, which is like the 70 top research universities. It's like their trade association. And he, has said in interviews, he's talked about how they normally only meet once a year under his leadership. And during this crisis, they're meeting once a week. That the 500 university president letter is almost certainly because of him. And he spoke out publicly long before Harvard drew the line. So I say this about Princeton, which actually the people I collaborate with most outside of the University of California are both Princeton faculty. I say this with great affection for Princeton. Also Princeton, the building on the cover of my book is a Princeton, that Elizabeth, who's here from your Chicago Press, found that photo. This is a long preface to say, Princeton is like the most egregious case of endowment hoarding. So the Princeton endowment, I think, is like $35 billion right now. But the problem with talking about in these tens of billions of dollars numbers, no ordinary human is able to think of that scale. It just doesn't make any sense. So the way I explain it is this. Most endowments spend 5% annually from their endowment to support university of operations. At Princeton, because they only have 9,000 students, that means spending $180,000 per year per student from the endowment. If you go back to the 70s, it was about $10,000 per year after adjusting for inflation. So they're spending almost 20 times more per student from the endowment. I think most people would agree Princeton was a pretty good university in the 1970s, and it also has other revenue streams other than the endowment. But the thing is, as the endowment increased tenfold, more than tenfold now, they only increased enrollment by a fraction. So that's part of the story here. And that's why one of my things my hobby horses say, these schools should just enroll more students, which would itself make them also more accessible to people from less elite backgrounds, because the more exclusive your enrollments are, the more selective you are, particularly the harder it gets for less advantaged students to get in. So, a thought experiment, what if Princeton doubled its enrollment and spent only $90,000 per year per student from the endowment? What if they went from 9,000 to 18,000 students? Well, I think they'd still be a pretty good university. At the University of California, where I think we're a pretty good school, we get state funding, but not that much state funding. We have an endowment of $40 billion for the system, but we enroll 300,000 students. So these are some of the kind of scaled dimensions of comparison. The other way to think about this is that average rates of return for endowments at the top have historically been, for the last 4 decades, around 10%. So if you're spending 5%, then what that means is you're growing, even before donations, you're just reinvesting 5% of the returns. And so particularly in a crisis like this one, you can use the endowment to, in the words of Larry Summers, weather funding disruptions. So the week after my Times op-ed, Larry Summers wrote an op-ed in which he said the quiet part out loud. Yes, you can spend the endowment in an emergency. I did it when I was president of Harvard during the financial crisis. Harvard and Princeton are also doing this already. One of these things all these elite endowments are doing is they're actually moving a lot of their investments out of private equity. Why? Because private equity is illiquid. So you can't just cash out your private equity investment. It's not like a stock or a bond or a security that you can just sell. And so they've already done that. And they're also doing another and the other thing I like to tell people, the boards of these universities, as you say, they're filled with tech bros who are some of the most clever financial engineers in the world, or at least experienced financial engineers in the world. They can figure out ways to use the endowment no matter what the rules are. And one of the things that they do that is smart is that they borrow against the endowment. So Harvard and Princeton have together, last I checked, issued more than $1 billion in bonds and commercial paper to borrow from bond markets, effectively leveraging their endowments to do that. They did the same thing in the financial crisis. My university, University of California, during the beginning of COVID, we liquidated $3 billion in endowment assets to cover funding disruptions. That money that endowment pool that we liquidated is now worth $6 billion because we recapitalized it. And our CIO said at the beginning of the week that we can do the same thing again. So if you get university leaders saying, no, we can't use the endowment, we've got to save it for the future generation, that's not the case. The real reason they're saying that, I think, is that if you admit you can spend the endowment in a crisis, then you create an incentive structure for people to say that whatever they care about is a crisis. And whatever, this really is a crisis, so they should do it. Sorry.
Okay, there's a lot of hands. Anna, do you want to just, here, do you want to go here first?
Sorry,
Stay right where you are.
Could you speak a little bit more about the tax-exempt status, the revocation, not just for the university, but also for the endowments, as you're talking about bonds being created for the, by universities with their endowments?
Maybe we should take a couple questions, actually.
Yeah,
since
that's a
there's
good
lot of hands
idea,
up.
because I'm long-winded, so that way I'll
Okay.
address.
So here, we'll go here.
I just wanted a clarification again on sort of in whose interest is, or how is it in the finance sector's industry to kind of help dismantle the university that, as you said, kind of reproduces financial elites? And I guess I just missed that. And to what extent is that apparent puzzle a kind of, is that related to the fact that there are actually not just contests between cultural and financial or economic elites, but also contests within finance between different kinds of finance capital? So you sort of paid particular attention to private equity and hedge funds, and those have often been called like second wave or like alt finance firms, as opposed to the first wave, which is like traditional investment in commercial banking and like insurance firms. So to what extent are like, differences in their economic interests contributing to this kind of war over the university?
Do one more
Yeah, let's do one more.
question. Okay. Thank you, and I feel ready to be persuaded by the general hypothesis, but I wanted to just ask about the what is to be done point of finding ways to build coalitions between elites and non-elites, and especially in thinking sort of a historical long view, maybe back to World War II or so, in the kind of remaking of the university from that period forward, and also what you think is the long game in terms of remaking higher ed from this position of those attacking it. And I'm thinking in particular about, in addition to what Gabe was saying about the kind of elite institution as being a place of elite consolidation, that actually also the public university has also been a place for this, precisely the coalition building between elite and non-elite. And then there's just the question also of that is raised in my mind around student debt, and how you're thinking about student debt when you propose, for instance, the radical expansion of undergrad populations at the elite universities.
Yeah. Can you say your question one more time? Yeah.
If you could just speak more about the tax-exempt status,
Right.
particularly in also within the context of universities issuing bonds.
Right. Okay. Yeah, on the tax exempt status. So I actually need to. I was talking with somebody about. Maybe it was Gabe. I was talking with this about before we started. I need to dig a little bit more into what kind of what is actually permissible for revoking tax exempt status, as Trump has said he's going to do. Just because Trump says he's going to do something doesn't mean that he can do it or he will do it or that the courts will uphold it. And I've been fortunate to correspond with a lot of lawyers about spending endowments, but I've not been able to talk with a lot of lawyers about that. I suspect it is much more legally contentious and legally contestable than Trump makes it out to be, and also probably hard to push through Congress. Sort of a weird thing to put in a congressional bill. One thing about tax exemption, I have a 2017 New York Times essay called How Elite Colleges Hide Their Cash that talks about the use of offshore tax blocker corporations with the university endowments. And so you could read that if you want to find something that I've written about this particular issue. But one of the things that it sounds like you might be tuned into is a large share of the bond issuances that Harvard and Princeton have done are with taxable bonds. So why are they using taxable bonds? Well, normally private universities, even though they are private, they can issue bonds. They can issue what are called municipal bonds. Municipal bonds are tax exempt, meaning that the people who buy the bonds, which are mainly wealthy investors, the income that they get from the interest that Harvard will pay to the investor, that income is tax exempt. So if I'm a wealthy person, I like to buy municipal bonds because I don't have to pay tax on it. That also means that the yield rates, which is the jargon for the interest rate on taxable bonds, or on municipal bonds, are lower. Because the investor's like, I'll take a lower interest rate because I don't have to pay tax on what I make from it. So why issue the taxable bonds? Well, it's because that's the tell, right? That they're borrowing against the endowment, because it's illegal to use municipal bonds to arbitrage your endowment. And so basically when you issue a bond, right, why do that? Well, it's because the bond interest rate is lower than your average rate of return on the endowment. So if I only pay a 5% interest rate on my bond borrowing, but I make a 10% average annual rate of return on the endowment, it's smart from an individual university perspective to do that. So while, like many of you, I have deep suspicions about many financialized things at the university, I wouldn't tell the university, no, just spend the endowment, don't borrow with bonds. I would actually say that's smart. It's kind of weird that the whole system is constructed this way, but given what the system is and the crisis we're in, go for it. All right. The next one was, how is this in the financier's interests? Well, I think and as Andreessen lays it out, I don't know that Andreessen is correct or that Andreessen is even sincere, hard to say. But as he lays it out, the theory is you have capture of elite universities and particularly their policy setting function, in his words, where all of the financial regulatory proposals for creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for doing antitrust, why does Andreessen hate antitrust? He hates antitrust because what his business is about building up, basically building new companies, or from existing locally owned companies, buying those or founding startups that displace people like pharmacies, like dental offices, like whatever, through tech. And then how does he really ultimately make his money? It's by selling the businesses that he's bought to an existing conglomerate. And so he hates antitrust because antitrust means when he builds Instagram, this is a direct example, when he builds Instagram, which is one of his big startups that he founded, then he can't sell Instagram to Facebook and cash out. So he sees the policy capture, the policy setting function of elite law schools and social sciences in designing all the policy agenda and the political strategies for advancing that, which I would say I consider myself part of that function. I don't think it's as hegemonic as he says. There's plenty of conservative policy scholars out there, and there should be. But he thinks, okay, what we got to do is just liquidate the university and liquidate those people, and then populate the universities with people who are friendlier to his policy worldview. I think that's the main thing. On the different interests, for time, I'm not going to go deeper. Maybe we can chat at the reception. Coalition with non-elites. There are flyers going around for my book to get 30% off from the press. You can buy directly from the press rather than Amazon. And chapter 7, the last chapter of my book, is specifically about coalitions between elites and non-elites that are forged at both in student debt coalitions for debt cancellation that involve a range of universities, and particularly how you get a lot of this kind of coalition building in public universities, and particularly in the sort of ideal type of the very large and very, at least economically diverse University of California system, where you really do have elites like John Perez, the former state assembly speaker, and Jerry Brown, the former governor, and Josh Pestalt, the president of the California Teachers Association, and Claudia Magana, the president of the UC Student Association, an American student at UC Santa Cruz, who are all UC grads. They're all UC alums. And you've got Dick Bloom, a private equity billionaire who was married to Dianne Feinstein before they both passed away, who's on the UC Board of Regents, which he calls the UC Board of Regents the closest thing to a knighthood in California, is to get appointed to the UC Board of Regents. But you have all these people contending with each other, building coalitions with each other. And so yes, there's very much a coalition building function. And I think public universities provide a little bit more of a model for visioning this, but not one that has to be, viewed as totally separate to private universities and what private universities can do. And regarding affordability and enrollment as like two things that you could really do and build coalitions around. One good thing that has happened at the wealthiest elite schools is that they've all essentially become debt-free institutions for their undergraduates. And that is both a real improvement for the lives of working class students. I'm looking at Elizabeth, who's making a facial expression because this is after she went to an Ivy League institution. So she actually lived with the debt of going to an Ivy League school. That is a real change. It's also changed the policy window and the view of what's possible elsewhere. At the University of California, one of the largest public universities in the world, it is the official stated objective for us to become a debt-free undergraduate institution. It's harder for us to do, and we haven't gotten there. We've made progress. So that's the thing. At the elite schools, though, that have gone debt-free, Well, it's pretty easy to be debt-free for low-income students if you only enroll like 5 low-income students and you have a $35 billion endowment. So that's why I think you need to think about expanding enrollment at the well-resourced schools together with affordability. And in the more immediate, less like visioning the future, so I gave a talk a week ago with the leaders of local Service Employee International Union, local unions that represent higher education workers. And I did another thing with leaders from AFSCME to talk about how these NIH cuts are gonna really hurt a lot of people. And they have actually much more of a playbook for how to fight the cuts in the congressional bill than the universities do. So thinking about these organizations that mediate elites and non-elites, I think is an important part of thinking about this. And we can talk more about debt cancellation in the reception if you're able to hang around.
Yeah, I like the other question. I feel a little bit of fuzziness and kind of maybe it's a contradiction. It does seem like, at least you chronicle, that there are some elites, and specifically financial elites, that are against higher education or elite higher education, or have antagonistic relationships towards us. But not only are they necessarily trying to co-opt these types of universities, they may just be rejecting them in their entirety. But it does also seem like from your book, the most compelling takeaway for me is that these financial elites actually are reliant on these institutions, and that financialized capitalism requires these institutions. So if they are successful, one, is that a contradiction? And if they're successful and these institutions don't exist in the future, I mean, will it transform financialized capitalism, as it seems you posit that there is a true linkage?
Yeah.
Let's take a couple.
Yeah, good. Sorry. Okay, thanks. Gotta write them down.
Thanks. I have so many questions I'm trying to decide. The point that you made at the just now about those that are better able to organize made me think about the school board officials that testified before Congress so wildly more successfully than the university presidents, and that seemed like one. So I was curious about that. And I was also curious, people have speculated that there's been, inside information from boards, on Columbia board, maybe Harvard, going to the Trump administration, and I wondered if you could speak to that, if you think that they're like tipping off the Trump administration about the most effective ways to undermine these institutions, or is that just wild conspiracy theorizing? And then I also have a question about this, like, segments of the economy that might better recognize their dependence on the universities. The pharmaceutical industry is an obvious example, and I wouldn't want to see them as saviors exactly, but their profits are so dependent on publicly funded research.
So I have two questions, I think. The first is about Andreessen and the Andreessen-like characters. So
Yeah.
Democrat who goes like full Nazi on one view in 8 years. So you had up on one of the slides the fact that there's something striking about the fact that many of these folks are attacking the same universities they went to and the same universities they sent their children to. And I just wonder, like, if someone told you the Mark Andreessen story 8 years ago, you might be like, sure, that could happen, but it's unlikely. And then it's like not only happened to one guy, but it's happened to a whole cohort of people. And so then that makes me think there's a structure that's behind this. And the obvious one, it's a hopeful one, but may have a less hopeful aftermath, is that it's a generational story. It's precisely that they sent their kids to these universities. And when they went to these universities, they essentially were transformed into elites. And when their kids went to these universities, they were transformed into anti-elitist, pro-Palestinian, Black Lives Matter activists. So, that there's a certain kind of generational conflict that's mirrored across the economy. And I think there's a less hopeful version of this story. One is that the cohort behind those students seems actually much more reactionary than maybe the current or the most recent cohort of students. The second is David Rubenstein is no help in this story, because David Rubenstein also, he might disagree with Mark Andreessen about his view of the university, but he agrees with him about the problems of this generation and protests on campus and who gets to do what where. And the danger is that he can't be our ally without us selling out other members of our coalition who actually have much more immediate needs than even we do. So that the overlapping and intersecting nature of the crises actually makes the elite, non-elite coalition really hard at the moment. So that's the first question. I don't even know if there's a question there, but the question is something like, is it generational?
Yeah.
The second part is to put a sharper point on Gabe's question about how you deal with an institution where you have a board of trustees that decides its own composition. And there it seems like maybe what we need in order to remake the university is for the Trump administration to win, to break the university, to fully break the universities as they currently exist, and then we just wait out until we get to rebuild them as something better. But in the absence of the institution winning, like, are there legal strategies you can pursue to impeach boards of trustees? Like, is there anyone who has a cause of action against a board of trustees that is willfully giving up on the educational mission of the university, or does it have to just break in order for us to be able to remake it?
All right, I got 3 questions and 5 minutes. Contradictions. Yes, there are contradictions. Yeah, I think the one thing I can add on this is, Andreessen and Horowitz in one of these same podcasts talk about how they get lots of their investment from endowments. Like, it's one of their major sources of capital. So, yeah, there are contradictions. Boards, the boards, and are they tipping off Trump? Well, I mean, in some ways, like, I think clearly, part of the Trump playbook he's getting from, like, people like Andreessen and Horowitz, who's a former Columbia trustee. But I do think there are factions here on the boards, and there are real divisions among the board members. On the structure and generations, the generational story makes sense to me. I am less certain than you are about a subsequent generation being more reactionary. I would actually say my read of the survey research on the sort of latest cohorts is that it's more that they're unfixed. And at elite universities, I don't think that elite universities are necessarily the hubs of the, particularly like the young white men who are flirting with the far right. For legal strategies, we should, maybe I don't think anybody has any legal silver bullets here to begin with. But I would say, let's step back and think about what the university is. And this actually circles back to something that we were chatting about right before this, which is, how is it that most of the universities in the United Kingdom are really effectively public universities? Actually, kind of like in the US, at least in the case of Harvard, universities in the United Kingdom in some ways like predate the modern state, and had a relationship to the monarchy, but had a sort of quasi sovereignty. That Harvard itself, is the first chartered corporation in the U.S. that predates the existence of the U.S., also had that. But universities in the United Kingdom at a certain moment became effectively public, in part and I don't know the story deeply, but part of the story is that the British state decided to almost entirely fund universities, and they have a more central state where that happened. In the U.S. context, so universities are private universities at least are nonprofit organizations, and as we've talked about, you've got a different set of issues and dynamics with private universities versus public universities. But what is a nonprofit? Well, it has its nonprofit status because it is, in service and operating at the operating under the permission of the government, and it is in service of the public. Now we see that this is like a complicated problem right now. Some of us, like me and an earlier version of me, might have said, yeah, maybe we actually need a much heavier hand for the government in the workings of private universities. Well, I'm not so sure that that's actually what I want right now, that the Trump administration is trying to do that. I've gained a much greater appreciation for federalism, pluralism, and decentralization in our nonprofit sector and in our polity in general. But I think we can ask these questions of what do we expect of private nonprofit organizations, and are there ways that via their charters from the government and their tax treatment, we can set not destructive and not intrusive expectations for how they might work as more democratic organizations tied to the society at large that they're supposed to serve.
Great, and on that note, as dismal as it seems in many ways, please join us for not lavish, but a reception. Thank you.